Hi, everybody, and welcome to the NDSC podcast, a place where management faculty and PhD students share about their journeys and stories in academia. My next guest is Professor Peer Fiss, the Jill and Frank Fertitta Chair in Business Administration, Professor of Management and Organizations, and Associate Vice Dean for Research at USC Marshall School of Business. This was a great episode, and I hope you enjoy our conversation and interview with Peer. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm here with my colleague Beatriza from the NDSC and our guest, Peer Fiss. Peer, thank you very much for being here with us. We appreciate your time.
Well, Beatrice and Jose, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you, and hello to everyone who's joining or who's watching this. I guess so we're recording this, so this will be for later appointed time. So, yeah,
Yes.
my pleasure.
So, Peer, this is, and I mentioned maybe a little bit of this, but this is a podcast we have and we launched last year, and the audience is mainly early stage PhD students or folks that are considering getting a PhD in management mainly, right? So before I start with the kind of like formal interview, I always kind of have as an icebreaker, ask anybody that I'm interviewing, who are you kind of like outside of academia, right? So let's put the books, the journals, the articles outside and the classroom, and outside of the university, what is something that you're really passionate about, maybe a hobby, something that you do and that has to do with peer outside of the school, right?
Um, well, there's so I'm of course sort of husband, father, friend, all that kind of stuff, and colleague. But outside of work, well, one thing for which I try to make time every day is cooking. And I found that I fancy myself a quite a decent cook by now. I've sort of spent a lot of time on it. I'm sort of a specialist in all styles, whatever it is. But my children challenge me actually, so they enjoy that too. But I found that cooking is good for my mental balance. It's everything that my day job is not. Meaning it's a quick turnaround. You don't spend years until that paper is accepted, but whatever you start that evening, you're going to finish that evening. It's working with your hands. It is working with texture, smell, taste, right? Sort of all the kind of things. And there's an interesting parallel. Sort of there was one of my colleagues that was talking with my colleague Benoit Rioux. He's in Belgium, and we share that passion for cooking, and we kind of said, look, there's a lot of parallel between doing research and cooking if you think about it, right? So both are, there's recipes that work. There's so the experience makes you better. You can there's never a limit. You can always do better if you wanted to, right? Sort of it never stops as a process unless you decide it stops. But and there's probably a lot more, so that we could explore. But yeah, so that's one of the things that I love to do. Apart from that, sort of this may be a little bit of a cliche, but I spent every summer, so my wife and I try to spend time traveling with our kids, and because my wife and I are both originally from Europe. I grew up in Germany. She grew up first in Austria and then in Thailand and Singapore. But we travel with our kids and try to sort of visit at least one different country every year, so they see something new. So
That's nice. So I want to do two quick follow-up questions from that. One is there a particular dish you would say you're locally famous, maybe in your family or within your friends? Like, oh, that when Peer prepares this dish, like that's your signature dish, or maybe if not, some a dish that you really like cooking, maybe.
it's been there. There's here's how I would think about it. I was just at I try to get inspired by memories or by trips. So yesterday I made a Vietnamese catfish in a clay pot recipe and that one was sort of my wife and I discovered when we were living in Chicago, and Little Vietnam had amazing sort of versions of that, and I remember going down to that area and buying the clay pots there. They're cheap clay pots, but they're specifically for that dish and they're kind of fun to have around. Or so I did um, a workshop, a joint IAE OMT workshop in Buenos Aires, Argentina, which was absolutely terrific experience meeting the scholars down there. And Thomas Fauci was among them, and sort of, and he invited actually all of us afterwards to a dinner at his place with an Argentinian barbecue, including sort of all what you would expect, empanadas to start out, and then wonderful dish and sweetbread and so forth. So I'm trying to get inspired by that and recreate those. But there's a couple of go-tos, so that I love to cook as well. But that's probably enough for now. So.
I love it. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so now we're gonna go kind of like into the more, let's say, formal interview, although it's
Sure.
pretty informal, I guess, right? But the first question that we got for you is maybe tell us a little bit of what brought you to this career and how was kind of like that decision of I'm actually gonna pursue a PhD, I want to become a professor.
Um, Frankly, this was not like for many, this wasn't necessarily planned. It's sort of a combination of, I do very much believe sort of in the idea of Seneca the Younger, of sort of luck is when opportunity meets preparation. So luck is not sort of randomly distributed, but at the same time, for me, it was sort of I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life until fairly late. I was in my late 20s, and after having worked here and there and done my compulsory service, Germany still had compulsory service, and I was studying sociology at the University of Hamburg, and I spent a year in a direct exchange program at Smith College in Western Massachusetts, and you might, if you know Smith College, you might know that's a women's college. So you might say, what was I doing there? Well, it turns out the graduate program is co-ed. So it was a tiny program. There was only, very few of us there. But while I was at Smith, I realized that academia could be very different than at a large public university in like Hamburg in Germany at the time, which was very impersonal, very resource poor, sort of 200 people to a lecture, that kind of thing. And I realized what it could be like to be both a scholar and an educator in that kind of a place. And literally sort of that was a little luck. But then seeing that, and after that, I was literally on a mission. So, and that I definitely wanted to get my PhD in the United States, and I was lucky enough to get accepted at the places I applied to, including Northwestern, which is where I got my PhD in jointly in sociology and management and organization. So, so to a large degree, this was not something that was planned. It was sort of I probably knew that I wasn't a bad presenter, so it was something of an educator there already. But yeah, it was like I said, as I expect for many to be sort of somewhat serendipity and a little bit of talent and match, and of course, so once you get into that, you realize that at least right now, it's still one of the very best jobs you could ever have. Sort of when you get to work with students, they're eternally young, right? So I get older, but they're eternally young, and it's in the end, there's nothing like when you can work with somebody and they sort of see something, or sort of a light bulb goes on, and kind of, or you jointly with a doctoral student work on something. Those are just things that I think make our profession very special.
Nice.
Yeah, so exactly. Along this line, exactly, you were mentioning that you like working with doctoral students, and what's your other favorite parts of the job? What is the most fulfilling part of this career that you chose to pursue?
Sort of, I think that probably changes as you sort of move along your career and priorities change. Look, sort of when I was a doctoral student and I got my first top journal article accepted, I was ecstatic, right? That was and look, when you especially when you're early career, you get an R&R. I strongly believe sort of that you take yourself out to dinner and you celebrate that, because sort of those things only come along ever so often, and you have to sort of celebrate those things. Otherwise, they go by way too quickly. So that was sort of early on important. Um, when I started, I wasn't a very good educator. I know sort of when I started at Queen's University, the first year I taught, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was not good at it, and the students let me know. So I plunked down a lot of time and really invested in building up my teaching until eventually, sort of, at USC, I've been sort of, I've won a number of teaching awards finally, but it didn't come necessarily naturally to me until I figured out that what I really need to do is, so it may be cliche, but if you're authentic, students can tell. And if you're not authentic, students can also tell. And I know I learned from a lot of colleagues here, especially here at USC, that look, if you care about the students, if you know what you're talking about, and if you are passionate for what you're teaching, you will always do well. Those three things have to be there. And if one of them is missing, then things don't work out. It's like the Anna Karenina principle, right? All of these have to be present for this to work out, right? So there's homogeneity in success, and there's a lot of diversity in failure. But those things, right? So then when you're teaching and students are, so when you get that moment, sort of the light bulb goes on, that's exciting, that's wonderful. When students reach out to you afterwards, like years later, and kind of, share something, or, during a graduation event, kind of come up and say, look, sort of this was just really, really made a difference for me. That's great. I used to get that a fair bit with the undergrads, but I haven't taught undergrads in about at least a decade by now. So I'm teaching the MBAs and right now mostly the MBAs and some executives, but I used to teach doctoral students as well, but not right now. Those things are great, and of course, let's not forget, there's always, one thing that I think is wonderful is the idea of creating something. So my colleague Claude Rubinson from University of Houston downtown, and Gary Gertz, he's a political scientist. He was at Notre Dame. Now he's emeritus. But the three of us just created a new conference that went for the first time last year. It's called AQUA, the Annual QCA Conference of the Americas. And we ran again this year at USC. It's going to be at Northwestern next year. And when you build something like that and people come and you make it work and you build a community, that is exciting. Those are, I think, the things that probably, the end of your career, you look back towards the interactions you've had with your doctoral students, your colleagues, what you build as a community of people trying to do better in advance. And those are the things that you probably will look back to, being most satisfied, as opposed to, okay, publish one more paper. And then that's great too, if it has a real impact. Of course, it's wonderful. But in the end, I think, I remember a graduation speech where this was actually funny. It's sitting in at commencement here at USC, and the Dean of Religious Studies is addressing all the graduates, and there's like thousands of people sitting there. And he starts out by saying, look, what do people say when they're on their deathbed? And I was sort of like, this is commencement. What are you talking about? And then he said, well, look, after sort of many interviews with people on their deathbed, nobody ever says, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. I wish I'd done more of that. But they all say, look, I wish I'd spent more time on things I care about, more time with family, more time with my friends, my children. And in the end, it's about the connections, the people that you connect to. So in the end, that I think is what matters most. And that's probably what we enjoy the most.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Yeah, I agree, and especially the making an impact part is widely chosen as the most fulfilling. And along this line, what is the most challenging part on the other side of the career that you found so far?
It's a couple. I put grading right up there. I have to remind myself that I'm having an impact, and that this is something that is so, because honestly, sometimes it feels literally like pulling teeth for me. But beyond that, right now, honestly, it is juggling the different priorities and creating some sort of resemblance and balance between them that I find the most challenging, between I do care about my teaching, so I don't want to compromise on that. I'm now a research dean for USC Marshall, so I have responsibilities there and doing something for others that so I'm also not compromising on that one. As you know, you always have to somewhat compromise because that's an endless task, but I want to make sure that I feel I do a good job. And of course, sort of apart from the job side, there's the family, and then there's research. And between the hours of the day, there's usually not enough time. So finding some sort of balance between those that's meaningful, I think that's what many of us struggle with. Look, we have, again, I think this is, the best job I know I could have, and I love it dearly. But if you talk about challenges, that's probably one of the biggest ones, kind of the balance. Yeah, I would probably point to that first.
Do you have maybe a little bit of an advice on how to achieve that balance, or maybe what's worked a little bit for you, right? Maybe, I don't know, because that's, I think, even PhD students also kind of like struggle
Well,
with that too.
well, again, those things shift so much, right? Right now, I'm much more of a manager, administrator, and an educator. Of course, when you're a doctoral student, those tend to be not the primary roles. You're primarily learning and becoming a scholar and a researcher. So the balance is different. I think at that point it's between your research and your learning and having some resemblance of life beyond that. To me, sort of, and look, I always felt that was a time when you need to invest in yourself and you have to work the 60 plus hours or so on whatever you're doing. And I find that I can't really effectively work more than 60 hours. If I do, I either get sick or I become really unproductive. And so in that sense, you have to know what your limits is. But I would say, developing good habits, but perhaps most importantly, make sure, if at all possible, that you have to work on something that you actually care about. There is no other way that you will spend the long hours and work at times past whatever, if you're late on work or past midnight or into the morning hours, if it's not something that you care about, that is important to you or to others for that matter, but you have to care about it. That's the only sort of way that I think you make it work. So I was lucky enough to find something that I cared about, a lot, sort of, and I was happy to do that. But to me, that's if you have that, the borderline between work and what you would otherwise do begins to sort of become less problematic, I guess, right? So I would say that. But I used to not work on weekends as much as I could. These days, I tend to work on Saturdays more than I want to, sort of, and hopefully that's going to be over once the semester ends, and I'm going to go back to something resembling normalcy again. But yeah, I think, so again, those things change over your career, but primarily when you're early on, you have to be passionate. Otherwise, I would also say, sort of, well, this is not work balance, but you will never be as quote unquote free or as unlimited as when you're a doctoral student, sort of having the time to learn, read widely, lay the foundation for what's coming later. Don't postpone, right? That's the time to really invest in yourself, and it'll pay off in spades later on. That's what I would say.
I think to achieve everything you said, a very important thing is mentorship as well. What's one of the best advices that you've received, both when you were a doctoral student and maybe later in your career as a professor?
I was lucky enough to get to have some really amazing mentors for that matter. So sort of that was starting with Paul Hirsch and Ed Zajac at Northwestern, and then the person that has influenced my thinking clearly the most is Charles Reagan, who was at Northwestern, then was at Arizona many years, and then UC Irvine, and sort of who. And with him, sort of, the mentorship has extended beyond sort of just academics, and also has moved towards things like, sort of, I remember Charles giving me advice on where to buy my wedding ring. So, so engagement ring at the time. So if I would ask him for basically anything in terms of advice, sort of So mentoring is a conversation. That's how I think about it, right? It's sort of, and it's a two-way flow. I've been fortunate enough to have some really amazing doctoral students, and I would say I've learned at least as much from them as hopefully they have learned from me. Sort of that study. Eunice Ree was my first doctoral student. So if Vern Glazer, Miriam Krikorian, uh, Derek Harmon, who's now at Michigan, Maurice Murphy, who's now at Georgia. Right now I'm working with Enlan Wang. And of course, there have been many visiting doctoral students, not just my doctoral students, but whose committees I served or so. And again, to me, at its best, it's based on mutual respect and trust, where you go on a journey together and so if you push each other to do the very best you can. And yes, there is that idea that I've probably been around the block more than a new doctoral student, but and that can be helpful. But in the end, I know I've been pushed so much by my doctoral student from the conversations. For instance, I sort of, there was a time when I was still doing null hypothesis significance testing, kind of correlational, writing those kind of papers. That's how I started off my career. I gave that up probably about 10 years ago. Now everything I do is either configurational in terms of methodology using set analytics, or it's qualitative work and theory work. But for instance, getting into qualitative publishing and qualitative research in the journals, that's something that Vern Glazer pulled me into, because he decided he was going to be a qualitative researcher and ethnographer. So my doctoral students have pulled me in a variety of different directions. That I think, to my mind, is sort of where, coming back to that metaphor of the mentoring being a conversation based on mutual trust and respect, and that is really sort of what I think is the essence to me of it. Now, you have to look for your mentors, so and some will be your advisor. More often, they will not be your advisor. I know, when I was at Queens, there were many people that mentored me, and some were, not even my field. Sort of. There's a guy called Steve Sartario, an accounting chair professor, who took a liking to me and really taught me a lot. There was another accounting guy, Norman McIntosh, with whom I had lunch every day. Again, sort of, Charles is a sociologist. I'm not in management, but has influenced my thinking more than anyone else. And he was not even on my dissertation committee. I learned a lot from Art Stinchcombe, sort of, I was, just wicked smart and really insightful in so many ways. A little weird at times, but that was part of him as well. But my point is, you have to sort of, I think, at times go out and find your mentors, and they if you do that, if you seek them out, that'll work. But it might not be a dissertation chair if you're lucky if it is, but if it's not, that's okay as well. Build your community, and I should say it's not just junior senior. I think mentoring at its best also is sort of what you would think of as peer mentoring. Sort of finding your peers who will read your papers and provide you their thoughts on what you need to do better, or give you advice on your career, and vice versa, right? You will get better as you learn from them and they learn from you. So look for that community would be my suggestion. By the way, academy, first time you go, very few people have a really good time, as far as I can tell. Most people have a hard time going to the academy the first time. The good news is it gets better. Okay, so it does get better, and you make friends and you see them. And once you've been there a number of years, it's really a lot more fun. And now that's sort of when I connect with my friends and colleagues I haven't seen and learn about new things. And I'm really excited to go there. But especially when you start out, it can be tough. You walk into one of the receptions and you don't know anyone. And you need to have a buddy, somebody to go with to all those receptions. That's essential. But the other thing I would strongly recommend, go to any of the early career consortia, what you're doing right now, right? The New Doctor Student Consortium. All the divisions have events, consortia. I went to a whole bunch of them, from not just OMT, but back then it was BPS, now it's STR, international management as well. and PDWs, right? Workshops at the beginning. You will meet people, be with them for a day, and you will have an instant community. And next year you come back and you see them again. So I would strongly recommend, sort of sign up for those kind of structured stuff so you meet people. And the next time will be so much better. So, so if you're intimidated the first time you go to the academy, and look, academy is a big, 12,000 people, right? Sort of, it can be very anonymous. So you have to, again, build your community, and that's how you do that.
I love that. Thank you, Peer. And I think, I'm gonna kind of grab from that to kind of close the interview a little bit. And the next question is about sharing a resource that you think has been very valuable for you. And you already talked a little bit about AOM. And maybe you can also talk a little bit more about Aqua, the conference you organize. And I was lucky enough to be a part of it a couple months ago, and I loved it. I highly recommend it. But yeah, a resource that you think has been helpful for you and might be helpful for PhD students or early PhDs.
I would, over the years, I've been part of many of these doctoral student consortia, workshops, sort of symposia, whatever it is, right? Sort of, and I've been lucky enough to, to also learn from so many of my colleagues who were part of that. So that gets me back to the idea to signing up for these kind of consortia, because there's a lot of informal, tacit knowledge that gets shared there. The kind of stuff that if you're lucky, there's some guide in the internet that you can read up on, but so much of it, you won't. It's partly socialization, part of the part of the socialization process, and well, anyhow, getting back to, so I've been lucky enough to learn a lot from those workshops, because my colleagues also shared, what they wish they'd known when they were doctoral students. And I collected, whenever I could get a copy of the slide deck, I would hold on to that. And there's a couple of things that I know I took away from that. And it's things that are probably not surprising that you will hear, but things that I believe are important. Oh, there's one thing I should point out. There's a wonderful article by Art Stinchcombe. It's called On Getting Hung Up. And it's basically about the experience of, you have a colleague, they're very smart, and they share a paper with you, and then a half year later you ask what happened, and they share the paper, and it's maybe a paragraph is different, and they've made no progress. They're not moving forward. And Art talks about this problem of getting hung up, and which often happens during dissertations, as he points out, because dissertations are these identity projects where you could do your dissertation on basically anything. So whatever you choose says something about you. And if you pick something interesting, that's probably because you're an interesting person. If you pick something boring, what does that say about you, right? So that puts a lot of pressure on you. So how do you negotiate that? Well, one way that you negotiate that, Art points out, is that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So you diversify, sort of you spread the risk, and you have several projects, at several stages. And one thing that helped me here sort of is to remember that your dissertation is probably not the best work that you'll ever do. And that's okay. In fact, it would be terrible if the dissertation was the best thing that you'll ever do. It's all downhill from there, right? Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot of pressure off you, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's two more things that over the, so that I've taken from colleagues. I think it's good to have a center and a periphery. A center is where you have the efficiencies, where you're, so if you do, as Will Mitchell once said, sort of where the discussion section becomes the introduction to your next paper. So you get some kind of scale economies because those things all reinforce each other. But you also need a mechanism to get variation in there, to connect to others, to connect to other conversations. That's where you have to have sort of a periphery where you can connect to others. And the other advice that I think is very good is be an expert at something. And that can be a theory, can be a method, can be a phenomenon. It doesn't really matter, but you have to really strive to get to the point where if you say, look, you want to know about this? Oh, you have to talk to Beatrice. She kind of does all that. Or over there, well, then you have to talk to Jose because he studied that from A to begin. That kind of thing is what you really need to invest in self. So be an expert at something. And it's got to be something that you're passionate about. But yeah, those are things that I found useful. Now, I haven't given you a like here's the website that you go to.
No, this is
Um,
perfect.
no, but to me, yeah, that's sort of sort of. I think it's. Oh, and one more thing, Brian Utsi, I remember too. We did one of these things together. It's something he shared. So if what somebody asked him, look, how do you figure out what's a good idea? And Brian's response was literally, so I do this too. You talk to as many people as you can about the ideas that you have, and you'll be able to tell. You'll be able to tell whether they find what you're talking about really interesting or whether it might not be a good idea. And don't be afraid of people scooping your ideas and kind of, preempting you with publishing them. I think that's a rare kind of situation in our field. So talk to your friends, to your peers, to people about your ideas. So.
And so just to wrap it up, and the last question we have for you, Pierre, is, this is something that at the conference at USC, the first lunch we had, you shared with a little bit with the PhD students I was having lunch with, some advice on kind of like developing a methodological expertise. You talked about advice you give to the PhD students at USC, right? And I think in my head, like QCA, set configuration analysis, I think about you, right, in management. So how do you develop that kind of like expertise? You were talking to about that, become an expert on something. So maybe talk a little bit more about that to kind of wrap this up.
And honestly, I got into QCA serendipity once again. Sort of. I was Charles Reagan taught the statistics sequence to everybody who was a PhD student in management and sociology at Northwestern at the time, and so I took his statistics sequence, and as it turns out, Charles was looking for a research assistant at the time, and he asked me whether I was interested. And if you've met Charles, you know sort of that he's one of the most amazing people you can meet. So I thought, of course, I want to do that. Not only do I get to hang out with you and learn from you, but also I don't have to serve as a teaching assistant, which was the alternative, right? So I got into that, and then so I learned from sort of just an amazing scholar, mentor, friend. So and I at some point I figured, since I'm already investing all this work, I need to leverage that. But so I got into that by kind of surprise. But I think if you're the advice I would give is, in terms of methods, graduate school is when you need to invest in your methodological chops. That is the time to do it. Once you're out of graduate school, it becomes so much harder to acquire a method. So, the advice I give all my doctoral students is load up on methods courses while you're a doctoral student. It's, to me at least, maybe it's different for other people, but I believe it's much easier to read into a literature at a later point in time. I've done it several times since. But to acquire a new methodology, or to learn Python, or to learn structural equation modeling, which was, when I guess I'm dating myself, was a thing, sort of at the time, or to learn longitudinal data analysis, or everything that goes around different instruments and causal identification, which by now is sort of something that you have to understand well. Whether you're qualitative or quantitative research, I don't think that matters. I took courses in experimental methods at Northwestern I was lucky enough, Thomas Cook of Shadish, Cook and Campbell, the textbook on experiments, right? Taught a course on experimental design. And I've never run an experiment in my life, but I know that all my methodological expertise got a lot better because I learned that way of reasoning. So I would really recommend, again, where I ended up isn't something that I planned, that I was going to focus on set analytics and QCA. It came along and then it took over my life, so to speak, right? And that's probably like 70% of what I do in terms of research, both theoretically and methodologically. But so I didn't plan it, but yeah, I think graduate school is the time to build that skill.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a great way to close us up. Thank you very much, Pierre. Thanks for your time. We know you're a busy person, so we really appreciate it. Beatriza, thank you for joining me. This was great.
Well, Beatriza and Jose, thank you so much for having me, and to everybody who's watching. Thanks for taking the time and for having me here as part of this. Thanks to the two of you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both as well.